Fleischergrund. Somewhere along the B294, buried in the quiet green between the Black Forest bones, there is a place that never existed on maps. A forgotten corridor of German earth where no birds fly, where moss has swallowed stone, where time decided to simply give up. The locals, those few remaining who still chain smoked behind diesel-smeared glass at gas stations, called it Fleischergrund, a place you only mentioned when you wanted to scare someone enough to stop talking, when you wanted the silence back. Wirtz, who ran the dyeing pump out by the only route into the mountains, liked to tell stories about it for spare change. He was a scarecrow of a man with teeth stained from decades of cigarette brand loyalty and hands as black as his fingernails. No one knew if he ever left that station. Maybe he was born behind that counter. Julian Mercier wasn't the kind of man who turned around when warned. The opposite, actually. He was the kind of asshole who leaned into every red flag and smiled wider the darker the road looked. He called it a filmmaker's instinct, but really it was arrogance painted with art school varnish. He had been driving for 6 hours already, and the gas gauge on the Citroen was licking the empty line like a thirsty dog. Elna had been nagging for at least half that time, but Julian was used to tuning her out like a podcast he never subscribed to in the first place. The others were half asleep in the back, Camille's head on Zoe's shoulder, Mathis snoring with his mouth open, and Nico pressing a GPS that hadn't refreshed in over an hour. Trees thickened around them until the world outside looked like it had been dipped in ink. When they stopped for fuel, Wirtz shuffled out like a barnacle pried loose from rusted hull. He didn't speak at first, just eyed them like someone who'd seen enough young tourists to know the pattern. First the questions, then the laughter, then the screaming. Julian was the first to speak, and he did it with that Parisian charm he thought everyone adored. Any creepy old places we can check out nearby? Something dark, something off the books. The old man coughed like he was about to vomit up a lung, and then he pointed north without even turning his head. Fleischergrund. If you want to die for a story, his German-accented French was cracked like glass. A village. Left behind during the war. Lost. No more people. Not normal people anyway, he said the last part too slowly. They all laughed, except Elna. She hated ghost stories, hated the romanticism of danger. But even she was curious. Maybe it was the woods, the hunger for something different after a year of safe routines. Maybe it was something else entirely, a tug in the stomach like gravity with an agenda. They didn't plug Fleischergrund into the GPS. It wasn't there. But Wirtz, muttering in broken words and cigarette ash, drew them a map on the back of a dirty flyer for some roadside schnitzel buffet. Once you see the black trees, you're already too far, he said, tapping the map with a grimy finger. But maybe you get lucky. Maybe you turn around. They never turned around. No one ever does in stories like this. The road became a memory. Gravel turned to dirt, dirt to mud, and then the road disappeared entirely. They left the car half a kilometer from the village, blocked by fallen trees and moss-wrapped stones. By then, the wind had died and the world felt vacuumed clean. They stepped into Fleischergrund like trespassers walking into an open coffin. The buildings were intact but bent, like something heavy had sat on the rooftops for years. Windows were smeared black from the inside. The doors opened with a whisper, as if welcoming them quietly, respectfully, like a butcher greeting a regular. Camille vanished first. 1 second, she was walking between two houses, talking about how quaint the architecture was, and the next she was gone. No scream, no footsteps, just a whisper of wind that hadn't been there before. They split up in panic. Julian screamed her name until his voice broke. Zoe was hysterical, trying to call Camille's phone with trembling fingers. Nothing but static. Nico took the lead then, moving like a soldier, eyes scanning the dark with his knife already drawn. He found the blood first, then the fingers, then the message carved in flesh on a wooden wall that simply said, "Breed." Night came like a curtain dropped from the sky. Shapes moved in the shadows. Groob was the first thing they saw clearly. He wasn't a man. He wore skin like a coat, stitched and stretched and sagging in all the wrong places. His face had too many seams, and his eye just one bulge from a socket that pulls with wet muscle. He didn't run. He just stood at the edge of the trees, holding what looked like a leg in one hand and a needle in the other. Mathis ran toward him, thinking it was Camille. He never made it more than 5 feet before a wire trap yanked him by the throat and dragged him up into the branches. His screams didn't stop until something began chewing. Elna took over then. Julian was shaking, crying, muttering to himself about the story, the shot he didn't get, the footage he couldn't find. Nico was setting traps, muttering war tactics, but even he looked pale. They tried to make it until morning. That was the mistake. Morning never came. The sky above Fleischergrund wasn't connected to time anymore. The sun didn't rise. Watches stopped. Phones died even with full batteries. Something deeper was chewing on the rules of reality. Zoe disappeared next. They found her in a root cellar, naked, covered in strange symbols carved into her thighs. She was barely alive, and worse, pregnant. Elna knew it hadn't been long enough. Something else had happened. Something fast and wrong. She did what she had to do. No one judged her. Julian didn't even look. Nico handed her the knife and looked away. Groob came again, this time with others. Stump, the largest of them, dragged a railroad spike behind him like it was a toy. His face was melted into something unrecognizable, like wax poured over a skull. He didn't speak. He just broke things. Nico tried to fight him. He had set up traps, prepared the battlefield. But it didn't matter. Stump walked through fire and blades like a god of meat and bone. Julian died in the church. It wasn't a church anymore. It was a womb. Beneath the altar was a tunnel. Beneath the tunnel, a cavern. And in the cavern, the mother. She was still breathing. Elna saw her. A thing that was once a woman, maybe, centuries ago. Eyeless, bloated, hooked up to machines made of bone and twine. She fed on bodies. She birthed monsters. She had kept the experiments going long after the war ended. She had no name, only purpose. Elna lit her on fire with Nico as last flare and watched the screams ripple up the walls like insects on fire. She walked until she found the road again. Her clothes were gone. Her eyes were hollow. Her hands were covered in something that had once been blood, but now looked more like tar. No one believed her. They fed her soup in a hospital that smelled to clean. Asked her questions with careful smiles. She didn't answer. She didn't sleep. 3 weeks later, she vomited in the middle of the night. Not food. Not blood. Something else. Something squirming. Something smiling. They never found Fleischergrund again. Even Wirtz was gone. The gas station boarded up. But sometimes in the deep woods near Baden-Württemberg, people say they see lights. They say the trees whisper. They say the black earth moves like it's breathing. No one listens. But no one goes camping there anymore either.